Officer Ryan Keller didn't even look at her face when he barked. "Put your hands behind your back right now. Ma'am, do it, or I will force you." His voice cut through that quiet aisle with the cold certainty of a man who believed no one would ever question him. And before Judge Lillian Brooks could finish asking why he was touching her, he grabbed her wrist with a sharp twist meant to scare, not to control. The pill bottle slipped from her hand and rolled across the floor. The sound was small, but every person in that Walgreens felt the weight of it. Keller's grip tightened, as if he'd found exactly the kind of target he'd been waiting for. "Don't make this hard," he said, low and impatient. Old ladies never listen. Those words, so casual, so cruel, hung in the air like a final warning of what was coming next. Before we go deeper into this story, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps more people hear what really happened. Lillian Brooks had lived through enough Chicago winters to know the difference between a cold day and a dangerous one. But nothing in her 72 years prepared her for the danger that waited inside a Walgreens she had visited for nearly a decade. She came only for one reason: to pick up Arthur's medication. His blood thinner had to be taken the same way a person breathes, steady, on time, without interruption. She carried the small order slip inside her glove, ready to hand it to the pharmacist, and she moved with the calm, steady grace that had defined her long career on the federal bench. Even after she retired, people still recognized her, though most offered a respectful nod and moved on. Today she simply wanted to pick up a bottle, pay, and return home to her husband. Shift manager David Ramirez noticed her first. He said her name under his breath with the quiet respect of someone who knew exactly who she had once been, but also sensed she preferred not to draw attention. Pharmacist Sophia Nguyen had the medication already labeled in large print, just the way Arthur needed it. Sophia smiled as she handed it over, saying softly, "Judge Brooks, I've double-checked the dosage. Please tell Mr. Brooks I hope he's feeling stronger." Lillian thanked her in that warm, measured tone that always made people feel calmer than they were a moment before. At 3:42 p.m., Officer Ryan Keller walked through the front door with the restless anger of a man who wanted someone else to pay for the problems in his own life. 15 years on the job had not softened him, if anything. It had hardened him into the kind of officer who saw every shift as a scoreboard and every civilian as a potential statistic. He had 2 arrests left to meet what his sergeant called an expectation, though everyone else knew to call it what it truly was, a quota. And failing to meet it meant midnight shifts, holiday duty, and Malone's cutting remarks about being too soft to survive in this city. Keller scanned the store with the impatience of someone searching for a shortcut. A teenager buying gum, a tourist confused by the self-checkout, a mother holding a crying toddler. None of them looked easy. Then he saw her, an elderly black woman reading the instructions on a pill bottle. Alone, slow-moving, vulnerable. Keller stepped closer and whispered to himself. Perfect. He had used that word before, too many times. Lillian barely noticed him until he moved in front of her with the rigid posture of a man rehearsing authority rather than embodying it. "Ma'am, put that down," he ordered. She looked at him, confused but composed, and replied with the patience of someone who had listened to decades of courtroom tension. "Officer, is there a problem?" He did not answer with words at first. Instead, he grabbed her arm, twisted it behind her back, and pushed her toward the wall. The speed of it shocked her. The force of it cut into her wrist. The pain blossomed faster than she could process. Sophia gasped. David froze. A small circle of customers stared, unsure if they should intervene or stay back. Lillian spoke carefully, trying to steady her voice. "Officer, please stop. You are hurting me." Keller ignored her. He tightened the cuffs with a practiced cruelty he usually reserved for people he thought would never fight back. "You're obstructing an investigation," he snapped. "You fit the description of a drug diversion suspect." The accusation made no sense, but he didn't need it to. He needed only a line to type into his report. Blood warmed the inside of her sleeve where the metal bit into her skin. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She stood upright. Though her body trembled from a mix of pain and disbelief, Keller leaned close enough for her to smell the bitterness on his breath. "Old lady," he muttered, "I don't have all day." Phones began to rise. One customer recorded the moment Keller yanked the pill bottle from Lillian's hand and let it fall to the floor. Another caught the angle of her body straining against the wall. A third captured the look in her eyes, shock, sadness, and a quiet dignity that refused to break. Keller pulled her toward the exit so aggressively her shoes scraped against the tile. As he marched her outside, he clicked his radio and said, "One female detained, possible narcotics." He said it with a casual confidence that came from years of getting away with the same line. He shoved her into the back of the cruiser, not caring that her coat snagged or that her breathing had quickened with the unmistakable edge of fear. The first video uploaded to social media before she even sat fully upright. A stranger typed only 4 words. "This is not right." Within minutes, those words multiplied across Chicago. Before Lillian reached the squad car door, the clip had already begun its climb toward a national audience, inside the freezing cruiser. Her hands throbbed. Her chest tightened with a quiet anxiety she refused to let show. She looked at Keller through the glass divider. He didn't meet her eyes. He was already preparing the paperwork in his mind, shaping his story before anyone could question him. He had no idea who she was, but in less than 5 minutes, 5 calm words would end the quiet routine of his life and begin the unraveling of 15 years of hidden abuse. The back seat of the squad car was colder than Lillian expected, and for a brief moment she wondered whether her husband had taken his afternoon dose without her. That thought, so small, yet so urgent, cut deeper than the cuffs that had scraped her wrists. She sat upright, hands pressed against her coat to slow the sting of the cuts, while Officer Ryan Keller opened the driver's door with the careless confidence of a man who believed the moment already belonged to him. He didn't look at her. He didn't acknowledge the line of customers filming outside. He only muttered to himself as he settled into the seat. Drug diversion suspect, elderly, refused commands, rehearsing his version of events before anyone else could challenge it. In his mind, this arrest was routine, a quick box to check before the end of the month. He didn't see the danger of what he had done. He only saw an old black woman in a winter coat. Someone he assumed had no power, no voice, no ability to push back. He typed notes into the patrol computer with mechanical speed, shaping the narrative he planned to hand to Sergeant Malone. Simple case. He whispered, "Easy write-up." Lillian watched him in silence. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, didn't plead. She simply breathed slowly, the same way she had taught witnesses to steady themselves before stepping into her courtroom. Her pulse was rising, but her mind was clear. She had spent 28 years watching the human condition unfold from behind the bench. Excuses, anger, fear, pride, guilt, redemption. Nothing surprised her anymore. But this moment of being dragged, humiliated, denied dignity in a place she trusted, this struck a part of her she never expected to confront again at her age. She heard Keller sigh as he reached for the gear shift. The engine vibrated beneath them. She waited until he turned toward her, ready to speak the script he had already prepared. Instead, she spoke first. Her voice was low, steady, unmistakably calm. "Officer Keller," she said, pausing long enough for him to look directly at her. I am Judge Lillian Brooks, United States District Court, Northern District of Illinois. 5 words, nothing more. Yet those 5 words hit him with the force of a falling wall. He blinked as if she had spoken in another language. His mouth opened, then closed again. As confusion scrambled across his face, he reached for his computer, typed the name, misspelled it, retyped it, then froze when the official portrait appeared on the screen. Her black robe, her federal gavel, her decades on the bench, the smiling photo of her and Justice Ramos at her retirement ceremony, and below it, a list of notable decisions, including one case he remembered for all the wrong reasons, the 14-year sentence she had handed down to his cousin for a weapons charge. It was the case he had complained about for years, calling the judge who imposed it cold, rigid, and out of touch. Now she was sitting in the back of his cruiser. His hand began to shake. First a tremor in the fingers, then a full trembling he couldn't hide. He reached for the knob on the divider, unlocked the rear door, and opened it so clumsily it nearly swung back into him. "Ma'am, wait, please. There must be a misunderstanding," he stammered. "Let me fix this." He reached for the handcuffs, fumbling to find the release switch. His breath quickened with a panicked rhythm, and sweat formed along his hairline despite the cold. The cuffs clicked open, metal sliding against metal in a sound sharper than any apology he might offer. Lillian did not move her hands at first. She held them in her lap, waiting for him to step back and give her space. Only then did she pull her wrists forward, the skin red and bruised. Keller swallowed hard when he saw the marks. "Judge Brooks, please, don't report this," he whispered. His voice had lost every trace of authority. It was small now, almost frightened. "I swear I didn't know. I swear I didn't mean." She didn't interrupt him, but she didn't comfort him either. She simply watched him, and in that silence he felt every consequence he had spent years avoiding. He reached for words with the desperation of someone drowning. "If you tell Internal Affairs, they'll end me, my sergeant, my record. I'll lose everything." His voice cracked. "Please, you don't understand what this will do to me." She finally spoke, her tone unwavering. "Officer Keller, I was not the one who made a choice today. You were." The words landed with a quiet finality. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She offered him the truth with the precision of a surgeon and the weight of a judge who had spent a lifetime separating excuses from accountability. He stepped back, stunned by the gentle firmness of her voice. "Judge Brooks, I beg you." But she didn't respond. Instead, she looked past him toward the pharmacy entrance where customers still stood, phones raised, capturing every expression on his face. In those few seconds, Keller understood something he had never grasped in his 15 years behind a badge. Power could disappear in the time it took for a truth to be spoken out loud. He closed the rear door again and sat behind the wheel, unsure whether to drive, park, or simply run. He rubbed his hands together, trying to regain control, but the tremor wouldn't stop. He replayed her words in his mind. He imagined Malone's reaction. He imagined the department's response. Worst of all, he imagined the news coverage. A retired federal judge, an unlawful arrest, an officer with 19 complaints, a quota he wasn't supposed to admit existed. Lillian sat in the back seat, steady and composed. She did not celebrate his fear. She did not take pleasure in his unraveling. She simply allowed the truth to settle, for the first time since he grabbed her in that aisle. She felt the cold fade, replaced by a quiet strength that rose from something deeper than anger. She wasn't thinking about revenge. She was thinking about Arthur, waiting at home for medication he couldn't afford to miss. She was thinking about the women she had seen in Keller's online record, the ones whose complaints were unfounded, whose fear had never been acknowledged. She was thinking about how many times this had happened before, Officer Keller finally turned off the engine. The silence inside the cruiser was sharp, almost painful. He spoke again, voice trembling. "Judge Brooks, can we forget this? Please, I'll drive you anywhere. I'll explain everything. Just, please, don't ruin me." She held his gaze in the mirror. "Officer Keller," she said quietly, "some things ruin themselves." He lowered his head, and, in that moment, without a single raised voice, the first crack appeared in the system he had depended on for so long. By the time the Walgreens video reached its first 1,000,000 views, Chicago had already begun whispering about the woman in the camel hair coat who never raised her voice, never resisted, and still left an entire police district scrambling for explanations. But while the city argued in comment sections and evening talk shows, one woman sat alone at her kitchen table, watching the footage on a cracked phone with hands that trembled for a very different reason. Her name was Gloria Jenkins, 69 years old, retired bakery worker, survivor of a life that had taught her to swallow injustice quietly because no one ever listened when a black woman over 60 spoke up. But tonight, watching that video, she felt something raw and familiar rise in her chest. The officer's face, his posture, the sneer that curled just slightly when he tightened the cuffs. She knew that look. She remembered it from the spring of 2021 when she stood at a bus stop clutching her blood pressure medication. She remembered asking a simple question, "Why are you grabbing me?" and hearing a cold voice answer, "Because I can." She remembered the wrench of her wrist, the sharp crack she tried not to scream through, and she remembered the humiliation of being left on the curb with a shattered bone and no apology. That same officer, that same cruelty, that same pattern she had tried to forget. Gloria placed one hand over her wrist, still a little stiff when it rained, and whispered to no one, "That's him." Her voice quivered, not from fear, but from the weight of 3 years of silence. In the Tribune newsroom, Emily Carter sat at her desk reviewing the viral clip for the 7th time. Emily was the kind of reporter who had learned early that truth rarely came neatly wrapped. She knew the difference between a one-day scandal and the first spark of a much larger fire. The comments flooding her inbox confirmed it. Among them was one message that stood apart. No shouting, no political opinion, just 8 quiet words. "He broke my wrist in 2021. I remember." Attached was Gloria's name, phone number, and a shaky photo of her old police report. Emily recognized the report format instantly, one of those files where the officer narrative overshadowed the victim's account, where the officer's credibility was stamped verified, and the complainant's statement was reduced to 2 lines. She scrolled to the bottom. Case outcome, unfounded. Reviewing officer, Sergeant Victor Malone. That name mattered. Malone was no stranger to Emily. She had covered his disciplinary hearings, quiet settlements, and 2 internal affairs investigations that had mysteriously vanished from the public docket. She leaned back in her chair, her instincts tightening. 1 complaint was an incident. 2 was a coincidence. 19 was a system. She opened CPD's public database and typed Ryan Keller. 19 entries, 19 women, all over 60, all black, all dismissed under the same language, insufficient evidence, complainant unreliable, officer exonerated, and every single closure bore the same signature. Sergeant Victor Malone, a man known for rewarding high numbers and punishing underperformers, though no one ever said the word quota out loud. Emily felt her pulse steady. There were stories that paid bills, stories that made headlines, and stories that demanded courage. This one belonged in the 3rd category. At that same hour, across the city, Officer Thomas Ruiz paced inside his apartment with his badge lying on the coffee table like a reminder he wished he could turn face down. Ruiz had been Keller's partner for almost a year, long enough to recognize the edge in Keller's behavior, but not brave enough to confront it. He remembered the Walgreens arrest in small flashes. The shove, the tone, the unnecessary force. And he remembered the moment Keller said, "Another easy old black lady. They never fight back." Ruiz had winced, but stayed silent. Silence, after all, had kept him alive in the department long enough to feed his family. But tonight, something else weighed on him. When he removed his body cam earlier that evening, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The red recording light was still on. He must have pressed the wrong button. He hadn't meant to record anything, but the device had captured everything. Keller's words, Keller's plan, Keller's mocking laugh. Ruiz sat on his couch, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He replayed the audio, hearing his own voice in the background, soft, complicit, afraid. He whispered to himself, "If this comes out, they'll destroy me." But deep down he knew the truth. It was already too late. A door had opened, and pretending it wasn't there wouldn't close it. By 9 that night. Emily was knocking on Gloria's small apartment door. Gloria welcomed her inside with the cautious politeness of someone who had learned not to expect justice, but still hoped for it. They sat at her kitchen table, the same spot where Gloria had watched the Walgreens video hours earlier. Emily asked simple, steady questions. What happened? Where? Who was present? What the officer said? How the department handled it? Gloria answered with quiet clarity, every detail stored in the reluctant memory of someone who had tried for years to forget. When she finished, Emily placed her phone face up on the table, showing her the viral clip again. "You are not the only one," Emily said softly. "I think he's done this many times." Gloria's eyes filled but didn't spill. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew I wasn't crazy." Emily promised to call her again soon. She meant it. When Emily returned to the newsroom, she opened a new file labeled, simply, Keller Investigation, Phase 1. She added Gloria's report, Keller's complaint history, and minutes later, a drop-in alert appeared on her screen. An anonymous file upload. She clicked it. It was the full body cam audio from Ruiz. No name, no note. Just a single sentence typed in the sender line. She didn't deserve this. Emily pressed play. The first voice she heard was Keller bragging. The second was Ruiz trying to laugh along. The third was silence. Long, heavy silence. After Keller finished boasting about padding numbers by arresting old ladies who won't resist. When the audio ended, Emily didn't move for several seconds. She felt the weight of what she had just heard. She understood immediately that this wasn't a story about one arrest. It was a story about a system that had been built to hide its own cruelty. That night, while Chicago argued about whether the Walgreens officer had used too much force, 3 people already knew the truth. Gloria knew it in her bones, Ruiz knew it in his fear, and Emily knew it in the cold clarity of a journalist who recognizes the moment a story shifts from incident to evidence. Tomorrow. The first ghost of Keller's past would step forward, and she would not be the last. Arthur Brooks had always been a man of quiet order, the kind who arranged his medication in a small wooden tray, the kind who waited by the window when Lillian ran errands, the kind who carried dignity in his voice even after 2 strokes had taken pieces of his strength. On that Friday evening, he sat in his favorite chair with a blanket over his lap, checking the time again and again. Lillian was never late. Not for medication. Not for him. When the clock reached 6 p.m., past the point when his next dose should have been swallowed with a glass of water, he felt the first wave of unease tighten across his chest. He called her phone. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. As the minutes slipped away. The unease sharpened from worry into fear. His hands trembled slightly, and he pressed them together as if that small gesture could hold the world steady. When the pain reached his jaw, he knew what it meant. He whispered her name, not in panic, but in the soft plea of a man who had lived long enough to understand that life often turns without warning. He reached for the phone to dial 911. His voice, once steady and authoritative from years of teaching constitutional law, now cracked as he spoke his address. The dispatcher asked if he could breathe, and he answered honestly, barely. He felt his pulse thudding in his ears. His hands grew cold. His thoughts scattered, drifting to memories of the woman he loved. Her laughter, her steadiness, her belief that justice mattered even when the world pretended it didn't. He closed his eyes for a moment, whispering a prayer that she would walk through the door before the ambulance arrived. But she didn't. When the paramedics lifted him onto the stretcher, he tried to speak again, but the words wouldn't form. The stroke had already begun its cruel work. They rushed him toward Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and in those final moments of clarity, he wondered why she hadn't come home, why the day had shifted so far from its routine, why the world had suddenly tilted under his feet. Meanwhile, Lillian was sitting in a small, windowless room inside the police station, hands still aching from the cuffs, wrists bruised, heart pounding with the humiliation that still clung to her like a second skin. She had asked 3 times to call her husband, explaining that he depended on strict timing for his medication. Each time she was told to wait her turn. Keller had already disappeared into a hallway to craft a narrative that would protect him. Another officer processed paperwork slowly, uninterested in the urgency radiating from her voice. She knew not to beg, but she also knew the danger of delays. Arthur's heart had been fragile since the second stroke. She tugged at her coat, trying to keep the pain in her wrists from showing, and repeated once more, "My husband cannot miss his medicine. Please let me call him." Her voice stayed calm even as fear curled around her chest when they finally released her, hours after the arrest, hours after the first ambulance had left Hyde Park. She walked out of the station with the unsteady determination of someone who had no time left for anger. She called Arthur's phone. No answer. She called again. Still nothing. Her breath caught. She dialed the hospital next. And when the nurse spoke his name, the silence that followed felt like a door closing. "He's here," the nurse said softly. "He is in critical condition." Those words were enough to steal the air from her lungs. She grabbed a cab and pressed her hands together tightly, as if the pressure alone could hold her upright. When she reached Northwestern Memorial, the hallways felt colder than anything she had experienced in the back of that cruiser. A nurse recognized her and guided her to the intensive care unit. Lillian stepped inside and saw Arthur lying motionless, tubes connected, monitors blinking steadily. His skin had grown pale, his breathing shallow. Dr. Elena Vasquez approached her with the solemn calm of a physician who knows the weight of every sentence she's about to speak. "Judge Brooks," she said gently, "your husband had a massive stroke. It appears the trigger was extreme stress combined with missing his medication window." Lillian steadied herself, gripping the side of the bed. She looked at Arthur's face, tracing the lines she knew better than her own reflection. She wanted to speak his name, but the sound caught in her throat. Elena continued, her voice low and respectful. "We are doing everything we can, but strokes like this, they take a toll. Right now, he's stabilized, but unconscious." She paused. "I'm sorry." Lillian lowered herself into the chair beside the bed. Her hands hovered over Arthur's arm, finally resting against his skin with a tenderness that carried decades of shared life. She leaned close, whispering softly, "I'm here. My love, I'm here now. She fought back the tremor in her voice, not for herself, for him. She knew he would hear her even if the world believed he couldn't. When Helena Grant answered Lillian's call that night, the sound of her friend's voice, usually strong, composed, steady, was different. It carried an ache, a breaking point, a truth that could no longer stay quiet. "Helena," she said, her voice controlled but trembling at the edges. "They broke him to get to me. I want everything sent to the Department of Justice. Every complaint, every settlement, every record with Keller's name on it. This ends now." Helena understood without asking another question. She had known Lillian long enough to recognize the moment when pain turns into resolve. "I'll take care of it," she said. By then. The Walgreens arrest video had passed 20 million views. Commentators argued, officials stalled, CPD issued a one-paragraph statement that satisfied no one, but inside that hospital room, none of that mattered. What mattered was the quiet rise and fall of Arthur's chest, the steady fight of a heart that had been pushed too far, and the silent vow in Lillian's eyes as she held his hand. This was no longer just about a humiliating arrest. It was no longer about bruised wrists or a shattered evening. It was about a man who had nearly died because arrogance met power in the wrong place, at the wrong time. It was about a system that believed no one would ever challenge it. And as Lillian sat beside her husband's bed, she knew one thing with absolute clarity. The war had already begun. In the hours after Arthur's stroke, Chicago slept uneasily, unaware that a fuse had already been lit beneath the city's police department, while Lillian remained at his bedside, exhausted but steady. Two people across town were preparing the first steps of something far larger than Keller could ever have imagined. At 3 a.m., Emily Carter walked into the dimly lit conference room at the Tribune and set her files on the table. Minutes later, Marcus Hale, one of the most formidable civil rights attorneys in the Midwest, entered with the calm focus of a man who had spent his life fighting the cases others were too afraid to touch. He didn't waste time with greetings. He simply asked, "How bad is it?" Emily slid the body cam audio across the table. "Worse than you think." He listened without interruption. Keller's voice filled the room, mocking, bragging, laughing about easy old black ladies he could use to pad the stats. The recording ended. Marcus exhaled slowly. "This is enough to open a federal investigation, maybe more." Emily nodded. "There's a pattern, decades long." He did not look surprised. Chicago has been hiding these patterns for years. But Keller made a mistake. She looked at him. "What mistake?" Marcus replied. "He picked the wrong woman." Before dawn broke over the city, Marcus drafted a preliminary civil rights violation brief. Emily gathered every complaint against Keller, cross-referenced the closure signatures, and traced the same name again and again, Sergeant Victor Malone. Malone. The silent architect behind Keller's record had built a system that rewarded officers for arrests and buried the complaints that followed. He called it performance. Everyone else knew it was something darker. At 4:50 a.m., the first emails left their computers, one to the U.S. Attorney's Office, another to the Chicago branch of the FBI, and a third to the Inspector General. All contained the same subject line: pattern or practice evidence, immediate review requested, at 5 a.m. sharp. Two FBI agents in dark coats rang the doorbell of Officer Ryan Keller's apartment. Keller opened the door with the startled confusion of a man who expected a reprimand at most. Not federal agents holding a warrant. "Officer Keller," one agent said calmly, "we're here to seize electronic devices connected to an ongoing investigation." Keller blinked. "Investigation? For what?" "She's lying. I fixed it." But the agents didn't argue. They simply stepped inside, collected his phone, his on-duty laptop, and the body cam docking data. Keller's voice rose. You don't understand. She said she was a judge. I let her go. I apologized. I tried to fix it. One agent looked at him and replied with quiet finality. The investigation isn't about one incident. It's about all of them. Keller felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. All of them? He understood then that this was no longer just about the Walgreens arrest. His past had begun to knock back, while agents conducted the search. Officer Thomas Ruiz sat at his kitchen table staring at his phone. He had received a message from an unknown number at 5:12 a.m. A single line. FBI seized Keller's devices. They will contact you next. Ruiz dropped the phone as if it were burning his hand. He had spent the night weighing his choices. None of them good. He knew he was on the recording. He knew he had laughed. He knew he had done nothing to stop Keller. He also knew that silence would not protect him anymore. When the FBI knocked at his door at 7:30 a.m., he didn't wait for them to finish reading the introduction. He raised both hands and said, I want to cooperate. His voice cracked on the last word. He reached for the body cam chip he had placed in an envelope earlier that morning. I didn't mean for it to record, but it did. The agent accepted it and asked, Officer Ruiz, are you willing to testify? Ruiz swallowed hard. Yes, I'm tired of pretending. By noon, the federal government had enough to move forward. The U.S. attorney ordered a pattern or practice review, one of the most serious tools available for investigating systemic police misconduct. The scope was clear. Racial targeting of elderly black women, falsified or exaggerated arrests, a quota structure disguised as expectations, and a chain of command that routinely dismissed legitimate complaints. Every document Emily sent became a brick in the foundation of the case. Every second of the body cam audio became proof of deliberate harm, not accident. Every complaint signed off by Malone became part of a timeline stretching back 15 years, across the city. Sergeant Malone sat in a Bridgeport bar sipping a drink he didn't need, scrolling through the viral footage on his phone, irritated more than worried. He muttered to the bartender, just another loud case. They'll forget in a week. But when he checked his voicemail, the first message made him drop the glass. It was from Internal Affairs, ordering him to report immediately. The second was from his union rep, telling him to remain silent until further notice. The third was from his precinct commander, short and sharp. Where are you? Call me now. Malone knew enough about federal reviews to understand what that meant. When the hammer falls, it does not fall softly. Meanwhile, in the quiet of the hospital room, Lillian held Arthur's hand as the machines around him hummed with steady but fragile rhythm. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten. But she remained composed, as if her stillness alone could anchor him. Her phone buzzed with updates from Helena Grant, Emily Carter, and Marcus Hale. She read each message carefully. She said nothing aloud, but inside, she felt the shift. The truth was no longer buried under paperwork. It was rising at the Tribune. Emily filed her article at 4 p.m. The headline was simple and devastating. Body cam audio reveals officers targeted elderly black women to meet hidden arrest quotas. She didn't use Keller's excuses. She didn't soften Malone's role. She wrote what the evidence proved. This was not an isolated case. It was a structure, a strategy, a habit protected by silence, by evening. National outlets picked up the story. Federal spokespeople refused to comment. Chicago officials scrambled to hold press conferences that answered nothing. And while the city braced for the storm, the people at the center of the truth stood firm. Marcus prepared the civil filing. Emily prepared the investigative series. Helena prepared documentation for DOJ. Ruiz prepared to testify. And Keller, sitting alone in his apartment with no devices, no union support, and no partner to defend him, realized the arrogance that once felt like protection had become the weight pulling him under. The federal hammer had not merely fallen, It had landed with the force of every voice Keller once believed would stay silent, 14 months after the arrest. The federal courthouse at Detention carried a tension that felt almost physical, the kind that settled into hallways and whispered between closed doors. People moved with quiet purpose, sensing that this case was not just about one officer, one lawsuit, or one moment of humiliation inside a Walgreens. It had grown into something larger, a mirror held up to the city itself. Judge Helena Grant presided with the steady calm of someone who understood exactly how much weight rested on each decision she made. She had spent her career watching systems bend and sometimes break, but she had never forgotten what justice required: clarity, patience, and the courage to look directly at the truth. Today, that truth sat in the defendant's chair, hands folded, shoulders tense, eyes lowered. Officer Ryan Keller, once confident, now shaken by the long, slow consequences of his choices. Lillian arrived through a private entrance, escorted quietly by court security. Arthur, still recovering from his stroke, could not attend, but he had insisted she testify. She wore a simple dark suit, no jewelry, no flourish, only dignity, when she stepped into the courtroom. Every murmured voice fell silent. She walked with the slow steadiness of someone who had weathered pain and refused to let it define her. Keller did not look up, though his jaw clenched when he sensed her presence. For the first time, he felt the full scope of what he had done. Not in headlines, not in legal briefs, but in the quiet way she carried herself. Marcus Hale stood at the plaintiff's table, his notes neatly arranged, his expression focused. He had built cases like this before, but this one carried a particular gravity. Not because Lillian had once been a federal judge, but because the evidence exposed a pattern no one could excuse. He glanced toward Keller briefly, just long enough to acknowledge him, just long enough to signal that nothing about this would be softened. The trial opened with the video, the grainy but unmistakable footage of Keller grabbing Lillian's wrist, twisting it, shoving her against the wall, the pill bottle rolling out of her hand, her quiet voice saying, "Officer, please stop." Every juror watched it in absolute silence. Some leaned forward, some closed their eyes for a breath, but none looked away. Then came the second video, the one recorded from inside the cruiser, the one showing Lillian sitting in the back seat, bruised yet composed, speaking the 5 words that shattered Keller's confidence. "I am Judge Lillian Brooks." The jurors shifted again, hearing the shock in Keller's voice, the sudden panic, the trembling in his hands as he tried to undo the cuffs he had tightened minutes earlier. But it was the audio that changed the energy of the room. When Ruiz's body cam recording played, Keller bragging, mocking, calling elderly black women easy arrests. A deep unease settled over the courtroom. The jurors exchanged glances. One woman covered her mouth. A man shook his head slowly. They listened to the casual cruelty in Keller's voice, the tone of someone who believed he would never be questioned, never be challenged, never be held accountable. When the recording ended, the room stayed silent long enough for Judge Grant to let the moment breathe. She understood how truth sometimes needed quiet space to settle. Then came the testimony. Gloria Jenkins, wearing a modest blouse and sitting upright despite her nerves, told the jury about the day Keller broke her wrist. She described the snap she felt, the disbelief in her chest, the way he left her at the bus stop as if she were a nuisance rather than a person. She spoke softly, her voice carrying the tremble of memory. But her words were clear. When Marcus showed the X-ray of her fractured bone, the courtroom grew still. Gloria finished with a sentence she had held inside for years. "I knew no one would believe me, but she made them see it." Officer Thomas Ruiz followed, shoulders hunched, voice uneven. He admitted his fear, his silence, his guilt. He explained how the quota culture operated, how Malone instructed officers to find numbers, how Keller repeatedly targeted older black women because they won't fight back, and the paperwork is easy. Ruiz didn't try to save himself. He answered every question with honesty, even when the truth exposed his own failures. When Marcus asked why he finally came forward, Ruiz lowered his eyes and said, "Because she deserved better? They all did." When Sergeant Malone took the stand, the room shifted again. He arrived with rehearsed confidence, but it cracked within minutes. Marcus questioned him, line by line, signature by signature, through 18 dismissed complaints. Malone tried to justify the closures. He tried to claim lack of evidence, but the pattern was unmistakable. The jurors saw the consistency. They saw the protection Keller had enjoyed. They saw the machinery behind the misconduct. And when Marcus showed the table comparing all 19 victims, ages 60 to 84, all black, all women, Malone's silence became its own confession. Finally, it was Lillian's turn. She rose slowly, walked to the witness stand with calm determination, and took her seat. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Her voice never wavered. She described the arrest with clinical precision, every movement, every word, every moment of pain. She spoke not with anger, but with truth, the kind that carries more weight than any outburst. When Marcus asked how she felt during the arrest, she took a long breath. "I have sentenced criminals, but I have never been stripped of dignity the way he stripped it from me." When he asked what the arrest did to her husband, she closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with quiet strength. It cost him his health. It cost him his voice. It nearly cost him his life. The jury listened with the solemnity of people absorbing something that could not be undone. In closing arguments, Marcus stood before them, hands steady. This case is not just about a retired judge. It is about every woman who filed a complaint and was ignored. It is about every arrest that never should have happened. It is about a system that looked away. Today, you decide whether that silence continues or whether it ends here. Keller's attorney spoke next, but his words carried no weight against the evidence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Their verdict was unanimous. The city of Chicago was liable for $8.4 million in damages. Keller, personally liable for $75,000, and most defining of all, the jury found intentional racial targeting. Keller burst into tears at the defense table, loud, unguarded sobs that came from a place deeper than embarrassment. For the first time, he understood the full cost of what he had done, not just to Lillian, but to every woman before her. Lillian watched in silence, not with vindication, not with triumph, only with the quiet recognition that truth, once spoken, cannot be returned to silence. The courtroom clerk read the final line of the verdict, and with it, the city changed forever. When the verdict was read and the courtroom emptied, the story did not end. It simply shifted into a different chapter, one measured not by headlines, but by the slow, unyielding consequences that follow truth once it finally rises to the surface. Lives changed, careers collapsed, and for some, redemption arrived only after every illusion had been stripped away. In the months that followed, Chicago watched each person connected to the case step into a future shaped by choices they could no longer outrun. Ryan Keller was the first to face the law he once believed would always protect him. The federal indictment under Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, came swiftly: deprivation of rights, excessive force, and willful misconduct. He stood before a different judge now, without the uniform that once made him feel untouchable. His posture had changed. His voice had changed. All the bravado that filled the body cam audio was gone. Keller pleaded guilty after Ruiz agreed to testify, and the plea agreement laid out the full truth: a pattern of targeting elderly black women, falsifying narratives, and abusing authority for years. When the judge sentenced him to 34 months in federal prison, he did not argue. He simply nodded, the reality settling over him with the weight of every dismissed complaint he once laughed about. His marriage dissolved within weeks. His ex-wife moved the children to Oregon after his release. The only job he could find was mopping floors at a West Side elementary school. The children avoided him. Teachers whispered, and every night he walked home knowing that the life he destroyed most completely was his own. Sergeant Victor Malone fell next. For years he had operated behind the scenes, shaping numbers, burying complaints, protecting officers like Keller, and calling it good policing. Those days ended when the DOJ completed its pattern or practice report. Malone was not charged, but the findings were devastating. He lost his sergeant's stripes, was reassigned to foot patrol, and placed under heavy internal review. His pension faced legal challenges. His union distanced itself, calling him a liability. The man who once controlled schedules, assignments, and careers now carried a clipboard and walked beats he hadn't worked in decades. Within 3 months, he filed for medical retirement citing stress and hypertension. It was approved. He moved to Florida, telling neighbors he had voluntarily retired, though everyone could hear the bitterness in his voice when he spoke about Chicago. He started spending afternoons sitting alone outside a small apartment complex, grumbling about unfair investigations, never acknowledging the harm he had helped create. Officer Thomas Ruiz, who had once stayed silent out of fear, carried his own burden. His cooperation spared him a lengthy sentence, but it did not absolve him. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of failing to intervene and was sentenced to 11 months in federal custody. During his testimony, he did not protect himself. He admitted what he had done, what he had ignored, and what he wished he had changed sooner. Those admissions cost him his badge, his reputation, and the trust of many who once called him friend. But for Ruiz, the hardest part came later. When the families of the women Keller had harmed looked at him in the hallway outside the courtroom, some forgiving, some not. After his release, he took work as a delivery driver. He stayed quiet. He stayed humble. And for the first time in years, he slept without the weight of silence pressing on his chest. For Gloria Jenkins, the woman who broke the wall of fear by coming forward, the verdict changed her life in a way she never imagined at her age. She received a $1.2 million settlement for the wrist Keller fractured in 2021, but the money was not what mattered most. What mattered was being believed, publicly, unequivocally, and permanently. She used part of the settlement to buy her granddaughter a home in Bronzeville, a place where the child could grow without the shadow of fear her grandmother had lived under for so long. Gloria attended every day of the trial, sitting behind Lillian with quiet dignity. When the verdict came, she placed a hand on Lillian's shoulder and whispered, "You gave us all our voices back." It was a moment Lillian carried with her long after the courtroom lights dimmed. Arthur Brooks, fragile yet stubbornly alive, emerged slowly from a long coma that stretched to 41 days when he finally opened his eyes. The room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the machines. Lillian leaned close, unsure if he would recognize her. He blinked once, then twice, and whispered the same words he had said to her after every victory of her long judicial career. "You won." His voice was weak, but the meaning was undeniable. He understood what had happened even without hearing the full story. He felt the cost in his own body, and he knew the price had been paid with dignity. Recovery was slow. His memory returned in pieces, but his love for Lillian remained whole, untouched by the stroke that had nearly taken him. And then there was Judge Lillian Brooks herself. After the verdict, colleagues urged her to rest, to retire fully, to step away from the strain of public life. but she returned to the federal bench part-time, determined not to let one officer's abuse diminish the work she had spent a lifetime building. Months later, she presided over the sentencing of another officer convicted of brutality. As she delivered a 20-year federal sentence, she looked at the defendant with the same clear, unwavering gaze she had given Keller in the back of the cruiser. She spoke a single line that echoed across the silent courtroom. "Power is responsibility. You forgot." She then nodded to the clerk, signaling the end of the hearing with the same calm authority she had always carried. In the end, the case did something larger than reshape the lives of those involved. It forced the city to confront a system too long protected by silence. Training programs changed, supervisors were reassigned, old complaints were reopened, and for the first time in years, elderly women from neighborhoods across Chicago walked into police stations with the confidence that their voices might finally be heard. As for Lillian, she carried no triumph, only resolve. And every time she passed the mirror in her home, she saw the faint marks on her wrists and remembered the truth that guided her through every courtroom, every verdict, every moment of her life. Justice is not loud, and it is not quick. It is steady, it is deliberate, and when it finally arrives, it changes everything. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it moved you, take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who cares about justice. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them.